Welcoming to the stage again here is a man that just got his bachelor's degree last year from Southampton Solent University and is also working on his PhD. He's going to talk about high intensity exercise, the lower back. Give him a round of applause. James Steele II. James Steele II. Yeah, here we go.
Oh, I knew that was going to happen. There we go. There we go. Got it. Thank you. Yeah. Oh, bending over too much. Okay, guys. Right. I'm hoping that this talk isn't going to bore any of you too much. I was a bit sort of apprehensive about talking about this topic to you guys. It's a big interest of mine, obviously. I'm doing my PhD in it. I'm doing a lot of intensive research on it. So for me, it's very interesting. So I had to think quite a lot about how to relate it to you guys. And really, I kind of thought about how prevalent it is, yet how unpretentious the nature of chronic low back pain is. I mean, like, who here's had back pain, got back pain, knows someone with back pain? That's probably about 80% of you, which corresponds to the research figures, quite interestingly. But anyway, yeah, just really to kind of give you an introduction of how I kind of got into it, because a lot of people ask me that. They say, you know, how did you get into back pain? It's a bit of a weird topic. Like Peter said, I've just finished my bachelor's degree in applied sports science. Before I started that, I was very interested in kind of like exercise and how it relates to health and fitness, despite their shady definitions, and the effect that exercise can have on the body. So I went and did an applied sports science degree with my main focus being on exercise physiology. At that time, I was getting introduced to kind of the concepts of high intensity training. I'm sure you guys are aware of like Drew Bay, Doug McGuff, Arthur Jones, and I was reading their works. I was reading Mike Mentzer's works at the time, and kind of coincidentally, when I then got to Southampton Solent to start my degree, one of my lecturers there was involved with some research using the MedX equipment. We specifically had a MedX lumbar extension machine there. And it was quite interesting that I was just reading all of Arthur Jones's works at the time, and I kind of arrived at the university and was like, MedX, where do I know that name from? And I was like, oh yeah, Arthur Jones invented that. And I got involved with the research, and it kind of stemmed from there. I really developed my interest in high intensity training, went back, looked at all the research, was thoroughly convinced by the evidence supporting it, and then moved through kind of the same way Arthur progressed from high intensity training involved with Nautilus, and moving through to strength testing and then rehabilitation for the lower back and other parts of the body as well. And looking through the research, I saw that there are a lot of big holes in our understanding of predominantly what might be the main causative factor of back pain, and potentially how we can try and treat that and try and either prevent it or rehabilitate it for people who suffer from it. So today's talk, I'm going to try and kind of first of all introduce, why care about it? What's it to you guys, whether you've got back pain? I mean, yeah?
Because I have it right now and it's incredibly annoying.
Yeah, exactly. Gentleman's just said, it's really, really annoying, like to just have this chronic pain around you like the whole time or recurrently, popping up, popping down. It's really annoying, and kind of relating to other themes in the conference as well. If you've got bad back, maybe bad posture, it doesn't look so attractive, doesn't really convey the kind of message you'd want to maybe women or other people you're trying to build relationships with. So we're going to talk about why is it important to care about it. We're then going to discuss maybe why is it so prevalent. So many of you have got it, so many people have got it. The figures are really high, but if they're so high, there's got to be something that's causing it, something that's having a real impact on it, and something that's meaning that it's going to, that it's kind of permeates our society. So I'm going to go through some of my ideas based on my reading around the literature of what the main sort of like associations with lower back pain are, and what I think has the most influencing factor on why the majority of people suffer from it. We're then going to kind of cover what you can actually do about it, because it's all well and back pain, this is causing it. or this might be causing it, this is the main factor. Great. Now what do I do? It's good to have some information of, how can you tackle it? How can you deal with it? How can you do something about it? How can you improve your situation? Because that's the main reason why all you guys are here, getting information and learning how to apply it and improve, your lives basically. And then I'm going to spend a bit of time just kind of going over what I'm doing and the impact I kind of envisage that my research is going to have, and talking to you a bit about what specific areas I'm looking at and why I'm looking at them, and how that kind of like is involved with lower back pain rehab. And then we'll kind of conclude and we'll have some time for questions. Just in case any of you aren't aware, although I'm pretty sure most of you are, that's the lower back. The bottom 5 lumbar vertebrae, and that's where my main area of interest is. So anyone's got questions above there or below there? I don't want to step outside my area of expertise, so I can give you an opinion, but if I don't know, I'll tell you I don't know, and I won't be able to answer the question. But anything in between those 5 vertebrae, I've probably got the knowledge that I can give you a good answer on it. So try and save your questions for something relevant. Okay, so why care about the lower back? Well, first thing to do is to give back pain a definition. What is back pain? If we're going to learn how to tackle something and why it's even important to care about it, we need to kind of define it and know what it means. Like Anthony was saying yesterday, some words and some definitions have lost meaning over the years. So to tackle a problem, you need to be able to define it and know what the problem actually is. Well, back pain is usually described as a kind of tension or a soreness or stiffness. There are all these kind of words that are used to describe what is essentially an overarching kind of condition in the lower back. Like you say, any of these things, tension, soreness, stiffness, sharp pains, anything like that, they can be annoying and they have an impact on our lives. We also kind of categorize lower back pain into various different sort of like subcategories. Now, acute pain is what we consider sort of short-term pain, so lasting anywhere up to sort of like 12 weeks. And acute pain would usually be involved with, an injury, maybe a sports injury, maybe you trip down the stairs, or anything that puts you back out, so to speak, and causes a pain. And usually, in the majority of cases, acute pain kind of resolves itself almost kind of naturally. Even the research suggests that it doesn't really matter what you do, the actual pain will tend to go away after about sort of, at most, up to that sort of like, sorry, I said 12 weeks, 2 weeks. After that sort of like initial 2-week period. The problem is, it's when the pain doesn't go away after those periods. And it turns into what we then categorize as subacute pain and eventually develops into chronic pain. And chronic pain is any pain that's lasted for a longer period than 12 weeks. And usually in those cases, it's when it develops into years. I've got some people who are involved in my research who I do my testing and rehab with, who some of them have had pain for 30 years. They've spent their whole life in pain, basically. And that's no way to lead your life. You want to be happy, don't want to be suffering. One of the other kind of problems with it, and I was speaking to a gentleman earlier about it, is it's very difficult. Actually, it was a cameraman. It's very difficult to give back pain, in a lot of cases, a diagnosis. I mean, we'll go on to it in a second, but there are a lot of different things associated with back pain that may be or may not be causing pain. They may be or may not be affecting the joint's biomechanics and then having a subsequent impact on other structures which may elicit a pain response. They may or may not be affecting function, so how the joint biomechanics actually function. So a lot of the time it's very difficult to say, right, you have back pain and this is causing your back pain, or this is causing the pain that you're experiencing. It may be nerve impingement, it may be disc degeneration, disc sensitization, or it could be ligamentous, it could be muscular, it could be actual muscular strain or sprain. But in the majority of cases, diagnosis comes up short. So people are labelled as non-specific. You've got back pain, but we've no fucking idea what's causing it. So in those cases, it's very difficult to then say, oh, if we've got no idea what's causing it, how the hell are you supposed to know what to do about it? And this is where the majority of my kind of like research is involved with. It's dealing with, what is probably causing that non-specific category, because it's around 85% of people with chronic low back pain have this non-specific category given to them. And it's only that sort of like 15% that you can say, you've got this problem, you've got this specific pathology, this specific condition with your lower back, and that's definitely causing you pain. So I'm focusing on kind of like, how can we figure out what's causing that, or what may be the predominant cause of those non-specific cases, and then how can we address that? So when I talk about, I'll abbreviate it as CLBP in the rest of the slides, but I'm talking specifically about non-specific chronic lower back pain. So it's back pain without a specific diagnosis that's lasting, longer than 12 weeks, and it may be recurrent, or, people's pain perceptions change, but okay. So just a quick diagram for you, and this is just to kind of like set the scene for my research, and we'll link back to it kind of later. These guys, Liam Vleeming, where is it? Yeah. They've actually done a lot of research and a lot of reviews on kind of like sacroiliac dysfunction, and they put together this kind of integrated model to say, like, well, in non-specific cases, we often use what's called function as an outcome measure, because it's very difficult to say, oh, okay, right, there's something specifically wrong with this structure, or something that's causing pain, whether it's nervous or whatever. So we use function, like the function of the joint's biomechanics, as an outcome measure. And what I've done is I've taken this kind of approach that they've used and the categories they use, and adapted it to be applied to the low back. So what we've got is chronic low back pain as a kind of like entity, as a kind of concept, and function as the outcome measure, or function as the perhaps rehabilitation goal. So what I'm looking at is whether or not, if we can improve function, we can potentially improve all these other areas that are associated with, may not necessarily be causative, but are certainly associated with chronic lower back pain. So the one thing I am doing is focusing on the physical characteristics involved with it. That section there, psychological and psychosocial instances, my research doesn't tend to focus on that. Like I said, I come from an exercise physiology background. So although there is a psychological impact and a psychosocial impact, a stress impact on pain perception, which I'll discuss briefly in a moment as well, the main focus of my research and my efforts are looking at what the actual physical symptoms are. Because it's difficult also to tell whether or not the psychological stress is causing the pain, or whether or not it's the pain causing the psychological distress. It's this whole association doesn't necessarily imply causation. So I'm taking this model and I'm focusing on the physical characteristics, and more specifically in my research, I'm focusing on things like range of motion, disc degeneration, the actual atrophy of the lumbar extensor musculature, and also looking a bit at sort of skill-specific biomechanics. When we talk about biomechanics, if you guys are aware of kind of like Bill DeSimone's work, most of you aware of that? Seen his videos? Read? Oh, is it not up yet? Okay. Anyone read Moment Arm Exercise? Yeah? Okay. A few of you. Cool. Right. Well, Bill talks a lot about biomechanics, but as an overarching sort of like subject, biomechanics is split into various different things. So when Bill talks about biomechanics, he's talking specifically about, or from what I can gather from his works, is joint structure, anatomy, function, what some people might call functional kinesiology. But biomechanics also incorporates skill-specific movements as well. So through my applied sports science degree, when we were looking at biomechanics, we look at basically sort of like the physics of how particular movements, whether they're elaborate sort of like sports skills work or not. And one of these things is looking at what's called gait, which is basically your form of locomotion. It's a way of describing your locomotion. And people with back pain tend to have this kind of like variable gait pattern, which doesn't fit the normal pattern which we see people who don't have back pain have. So that's just kind of like set the scene of what I'm looking at and what I think is important to look at. And we're going to link back to this, and I'm going to describe in more detail the actual research I'm doing and why it's sort of like important, and potentially the results that I'm hoping to see. Okay. Right, so as I was saying, chronic lower back pain, really prevalent, really unpretentious though, and I've started using this word recently. I think I might have used it in the kind of thing about me I put on the 21convention.com. It's this unpretentious condition that is everywhere. Everyone has it. No one really talks about it. It's not that kind of scary. It doesn't necessarily kill you. Although, interestingly, in some cases, I've read case studies and examples of people who have been so sort of distressed by their pain that they felt suicidal. And maybe that goes back to the whole, is the psychological stress causing the pain, or is the pain causing the psychological distress? It's an interesting concept. But yeah, because it's kind of unpretentious and no one really kind of like thinks it has a massive impact on society, it doesn't really get a lot of sort of press, shall we say, unlike things like cancer and heart disease and all that sort of stuff, obesity. But it is definitely one of the most prevalent medical disorders. In fact, the World Health Organization did a big survey at sort of like end of the 1990s, and it actually ranked lower back pain as the second most prevalent disorder in their survey. The only thing that was interestingly and oddly ahead of it was iron deficiency anemia, but lower back pain ranked in prevalence higher than almost everything else, including heart disease, cancer, all these other things. So it's a real problem, and some of the estimates are that 60 to 80% of adults will suffer from back pain. So even you guys who haven't necessarily got any pain now or haven't experienced any pain in the past, it may come a point in your lives where it's very likely that you're going to suffer from back pain, and it's going to really cause you some problems. And also, one of the interesting things is the cost of back pain. Like, it may not have a massive impact, really sort of like severe impact, like death on our lives, as some illnesses and conditions do. But in terms of cost, it costs a shitload of money every year. Like, some of the estimates are it costs about 10,000. One of the most recent estimates for the UK was that it costs the economy in direct and indirect costs about 10.6 thousand million, which I think is a billion. I'm not sure. About 10 million pounds a year, and that's in a direct and indirect cost. So that's through the cost of healthcare, cost of and one of these problems is the treatments that are utilised by people with back pain, and also that's the indirect cost of if people have got back pain and they can't get to work, then that's a day's work missed. They're missing out on getting money for working and providing value for their company, and their company's also missing out on the work that they're providing for them. So there's all these kind of like costs involved with it, and it's this big spiral that just keeps continually costing more and more money. And the way the kind of economy is going at the moment with the rates of inflation, that seems to kind of be skyrocketing even more. So, big problem. Click on. So, if back pain is so prevalent, like I said, there's got to be some reason as to why it's prevalent. What's causing it? What is having an impact on it to make it such a prevalent condition in our society? When we look at epidemiological research, which is a study of sort of like epidemics of disease or pathologies or whatever you want to call it, we look at things called risk factors. So we look at the things that are associated with, and that we can generate hypotheses about whether or not, maybe is that causing it, or is it associated with it? What link does it have to the actual conditions? So we look at things called risk factors. And in back pain, there are kind of mainly sort of three trains of thought and kind of categories of what types of risk factors are responsible for the conditions that we see. Excuse me. So one of these risk factors is these environmental and work-related risk factors. Someone pointed out to me those pictures actually look like they're just farting, and I didn't really realise that until after I put them on there. So, but they're supposed to have bad backs and injuring their backs, but you can think they're farting if you want. Something which I remembered this morning, which I needed to remember to talk to you about, was rice farmers, interestingly. I read a blog post a while back, and it's been a kind of interest of mine looking into back pain in like traditional and indigenous sort of cultures. The whole sort of like paleo idea and evolutionary reasoning, is really important, I think, in any kind of like aspect of the human sciences or any kind of like biological sciences and natural sciences. So just as a kind of like example, a lot of people have this idea that working conditions and therefore kind of like postures and that sort of thing that we experience during our work, whether they be, extended seating, like in 9-to-5 office jobs, etc., or the kind of like lifting that we experience in, doesn't really look like a manual worker wearing his tie, but you know, those sorts of things may be linked to high prevalence of back pain. And I'm not going to deny at all that, you know, you can injure your back lifting something heavily, or lifting anything for a matter of fact, if you're lifting it in a stupid way, if you're lifting it in a way that excessively loads perhaps the passive structures rather than the muscles taking the load. So, you know, I'm not denying that you can hurt your back doing stupid stuff at work or in whatever environment you're in. But interestingly, I was looking at some research in Thailand to look at and see whether or not the prevalence of back pain was as high in Thailand as it is in other cultures in the world. And the kind of prevalence that we see is it's very difficult to kind of like link things together and draw direct comparisons, because methodologies are always different in different studies, which is always a problem when you're trying to interpret them. But one interesting thing was, and a lady called Esther Goatley, who talks a lot about posture and thinks it's very important, highlighted to me that in a video that I watched that I think they're water chestnut gatherers in a country called Burkina Faso. You know, their postures when they're bending and lifting is brilliant. They keep a neutral spine, they bend at the hips, and they spend, you know, hours and hours a day spent in that posture, bent down, picking up water chestnuts. And she shows this picture, which I kind of regret not putting on here now, but you know, of these women with this wonderful posture, spending hours a day in that posture, and yet they seem to have no back pain. And she kind of uses that as a very sort of like eye-catching tool to kind of like highlight her ideas. So I thought, oh, that's quite interesting. So I had a look around at just some other research and some pictures. And I found this interesting picture when I was looking through the Thai prevalence of some rice farmers. And, you know, rice farmers in Thailand and in other Asian countries, you know, they pretty much have the same job. They spend their days bent down, putting rice in the, you know, whatever it is, the kind of watery fields that they grow it in. And interestingly, the picture I found showed that, you know, about half of the people in the picture, you know, they had this perfect posture, neutral spine, bending at the hips, and, you know, not overly loading the spine in the manner that these kind of like schools of thought would want you to avoid. But yeah, the other half of them had really shit posture. You know, they were kind of hunched over, bending down, and you're thinking they're spending hours a day in that position. So I looked at that and thought, you know, that's quite interesting, considering that she's also saying that the rates of back pain in Thailand are quite low as well. So along the lines of my trains of thought of what I think is predominantly the causative factor, or maybe the majority or mostly responsible, is, and we'll move on to it in a second, is one of the physical characteristics of the lumbar spine, was that there was actually a study done with rice farmers who found that rice farmers with lower strength levels in their lumbar extensors actually had a higher rate of back pain, and that was the factor that was most associated with it. Now, that doesn't necessarily imply causation, but it's interesting that the actual working conditions didn't really have a big impact on whether or not they had back pain. So what we can usually say is if there is no association, it's quite likely that it's probably not causative. So it's very difficult to kind of like say, you know, it's definitely that the majority of people are getting back pain because they're spending time bent over, or they're spending time slouched in their seats or sat in odd positions or whatever, because the associations just aren't consistent. They're all over the place, and they may be affected by methodologies and the populations we look at, but unless they're consistent, it's very difficult to say, yeah, definitely, that's it, that's what's happening, so we need to address that. Coming back as well to the psychological thing, and this links back into the whole work-related stuff and work-related stresses. As I've said, my focus isn't predominantly on the psychological stress associated, not necessarily causative, but associated with back pain. And I wouldn't want to step out of my bounds of that. Cognitive behavioural therapy is a very sort of like prevalent treatment option at the moment, and the research has shown it to be pretty successful in terms of you know, alleviating people's pain perception, perhaps. But interestingly, some of the research that I've looked at has looked at affective disorders, which are, you know, kind of like stress disorders and psychological sensitivity, and found that in the majority of cases they're not necessarily associated with the prevalence of lower back pain, but they affect the degree of lower back pain. So, the intensity of the pain they experience. So it's another kind of like thought to me that suggests, well, maybe psychological stress and those sorts of things aren't having, you know, a direct impact on how much back pain people or how prevalent back pain is. So therefore, they might not necessarily be the main causative factor. But in this whole sort of like holistic approach to it, they're going to have an impact on the pain you perceive, because pain is obviously a perception. You know, it's considered, it's perceived in the brain, and any kind of stress is going to necessarily have an impact on what perceptions you have of that pain response. So while it's important, it's not necessarily my area of focus, and I don't necessarily think it's, you know, the main sort of thing, but it's an important thing to consider perhaps in addressing people's pain perceptions. And lastly, one of the areas of risk factors we look at these physical risk factors. So when we talk about physical risk factors, we're talking about kind of like demographic characteristics, so, you know, like height, weight, blah, 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 all these things that are people's physical, you know, characteristics. And some of these things, when we're looking at like joint structures and joint function, how the joint actually physically functions, like I was saying earlier, the actual function of the joint. So, you know, that could be in the lower back, the actual strength of the lumbar extensors. I don't know if you can see that well, but that's a little diagram actually from one of Arthur Jones's books, just showing a lumbar extension strength curve. And just a little diagram looking at things like range of motion as well. That does show kind of like gross trunk range of motion, not necessarily just specifically lumbar range of motion, which we'll talk about a bit in a while as well. Excuse me. Okay, so like I was saying, association doesn't necessarily imply causation though. So quite often it's difficult to say also if something's associated with it, whether or not it's really causing it or whether or not it's just maybe a symptom, you know. Maybe something else is underlying it, and when this thing has an impact on it, you know, pain is prevalent and something else is prevalent as well, all these kind of other conditions we look at. So it's very difficult to kind of like discern what's causing what. Now, in the majority of cases, and I'm of the same opinion as researchers like Stuart McGill. I don't know if any of you have heard of his name. He's quite a big name in sort of like lower back biomechanics and rehabilitation. He's of the opinion, and I'm in general agreement with him, that in the majority of cases, pain has an organic source. You know, an injury or some sort of dysfunction of the joint is what initially causes the sequence of events that leads to pain. So he focuses a lot on how various different physical characteristics of the lumbar spine have an impact on injury thresholds and the injuries you're going to face. And he also distinguishes between whether or not they're you know, acute injuries or chronic injuries as well. You know, whether or not they're you know, severe, like an acute sort of like sprain or a high impact injury, or whether or not they're losing the word right now. A repetitive injury. For example, like, you know, marathon runners get repetitive strain injuries. People can get repetitive injuries which can develop into chronic back pain in the lumbar spine as well. You may not necessarily, you know, get tackled from behind in rugby or football or whatever and suddenly put your back out. It may be sustained loading and sustained injury, but very small, and just builds up into this kind of like chronic response. And what tends to happen is after that injury, a series of events happens which leads to this final pain response. The actual peripheral nervous system, so the actual structures and nerves in those structures become sensitized, they become really sensitive to pain, so any more kind of stimulation to those structures will elicit even further pain response. And some of these things are, you know, you can get direct nerve impingement because of altered joint biomechanics and because of the function, and the discs and other tissues as well, facet joints, which are the actual joints in between the spine, the vertebrae, and the actual muscular and ligamentous tissue. They all have nerve supplies, and so they can all feel pain. And any kind of like alteration to their biomechanics may be something that's responsible for sensitizing those nerves, and then subsequently setting off a series of events to sensitize the rest of the pain response as well. So this may be why pain can kind of like develop into a chronic condition as well. Now, one thing I just wanted to point out, and it's something that interestingly that I don't know how many. Do you guys follow blogs a lot? You kind of bloggy type guys? Well, I'm a big geek, and I read a lot of research, and I read a lot of blogs as well. And I think blogs are a great source of information, especially if you can find good blogs run by interesting and critically thinking and rational people. So I follow a lot of blogs written by various PhDs and doctors, etc. But one of the guys whose blogs I follow is a guy called Todd Hargrove, who writes a blog called Better Movement, and he's got a very sort of like brain-centered approach on pain, and he's quite interested in this whole back pain thing. And interestingly, he put up a couple of studies, which I was aware of, and I've seen other studies, where some people who have abnormalities in the lower back, like disc herniations or disc bulging and that sort of thing, they show with no pain symptoms. So a lot of people have kind of like jumped on that bandwagon to say, well, if that's not, if they've got that problem but they've not got pain, then maybe that's not responsible for pain in the first place. Excuse me. But as we kind of said, like in the majority of cases, pain does seem to have an organic kind of like source that kind of stimulates that pain. And one of the things that has an impact on that is the severity of the injury as well. When you kind of look at these kind of studies which look at abnormalities and symptoms, it tends to find that the actual degree of injury, if for example we're looking at the discs can begin to degenerate, they can then start to bulge, and they can potentially at that point start pressing on nerves and causing a pain response, or they could herniate completely, in which case they can cause a real sort of like impingement on nervous tissue, or they can even move down into the actual vertebrae and stimulate this inflammatory cascade of events that can cause a really sort of painful response. And it seemed to me that the majority of links between abnormalities and pain were a lot more associated with the severity of them. So the very sort of like low severity injuries and abnormalities weren't necessarily as highly associated with back pain. So it seemed to be that there was kind of like almost this dose-response relationship between how badly injured the spine was or how badly deteriorated it was and the extent of pain experienced. So it may be that even when we see an abnormality, it may not necessarily be sufficient enough to have caused a pain response yet. Also, we've got examples where some people have symptoms, some people say they experience pain, but the scans show no pain at all, or sorry, no abnormality at all. And this is interesting as well, because a lot of people have made a kind of logical error here, where they've taken absence of evidence to mean evidence of absence. So it's this whole, in medicine, there's a phrase that they use, which is, absence of evidence doesn't indicate evidence of absence. So it's this whole, you can't prove the non-existence of something, kind of like going back to what we were talking about yesterday in the objectivism lecture. It's a logical jump, an illogical jump to say that just because you can't see something on this particular scan, that there's nothing there in the first place. Exactly. So, the scan may have missed it. Whatever diagnostic test they're using, and I just want to clarify as well now, I'm not a diagnostician, so these are my interpretations of reading the research. They may have missed something, or perhaps the abnormality was there, it sensitized and created a pain response, and it's potentially alleviated itself, the actual abnormality, but the pain's lingered because of the sensitization. It's very difficult to kind of then use these diagnostic tests and say, how worthwhile actually are they? And it's only really through the use of these tests and the kind of clinical wisdom of clinicians like chiropractors and physios that you can actually kind of get this small number of people with an accurate diagnosis. In most cases, it's not usually that useful. So this whole idea of kind of injury severity then kind of puts on this idea of an injury threshold. And in most cases, when an injury threshold is exceeded, and along the lines of kind of Stuart McGill's thinking, your joint structure will have a particular level of loading that it can sustain before it breaks, basically. It's like any kind of like engineering aspect. It will be able to sustain, any structure can sustain a particular amount of loading before it then goes boom and breaks. When that may be a spectacular failure and it may all collapse, or like an acute sort of severe injury, an impact injury, or it may be a sustained repetitive loading that may cause an injury over a period of time. But there's an injury threshold, and there are going to be things that impact how well you can alter that, or how well you can sustain loading before you actually get injury. Excuse me, I'm just going to grab some more water. So, if we're talking about injury threshold and loading then, one of the important things, and certainly coming from a from a kind of like exercise phys background is the extent of loading a joint can take is usually going to be dependent upon the extent of resistance that the musculature holding the joint together can actually withstand. So if you've got weak musculature, that joint structure is not going to be able to withstand as much loading. It's not going to be able to, it may have low endurance, low fatigue characteristics as well. And strength and endurance, you know, they're not separate things. They go hand in hand. If any of you are familiar with kind of Arthur Jones's like analogies on it, you know, if for example you implement a strength training program, so say any exercise, you start off with a maximum 1 rep max of 100 kilos, and you increase that to 200 kilos. At the start, say you could do a 1 rep max of 100 kilos, and you could potentially do 8 reps with 80 kilos. If you increase that, your 1 rep max to 200 kilos, then you're probably going to be able to do about 8 reps with 160 kilos now, you know, roughly 8%. So your actual endurance, the amount of reps you can do with a relative load has gone up. So strength and endurance are synonymous. You know, if you improve your strength, you improve your endurance as well. So there's no kind of like training for one or the other. And that's going to have an impact on how well you can, you know, withstand impact injuries and also sustained loading as well. And will have an impact on obviously the injury severity and then the impact that has on the pain response you have. So interestingly, and one of the most consistent things we find in the literature looking at observational studies in small populations and also larger scale studies looking at these physical characteristics is that a lot of the things associated with the actual lumbar extensor musculature, you know, the multifidus, the erector spinae muscle groups, show that in people with back pain, they're usually very weak and they're very atrophied, and they, you know, compared to a normal population or people without back pain, they're probably unable to withstand as much strain and loading as the people who aren't suffering from back pain. So all of these things, like the atrophy, the low lumbar extension strength, lumbar extensor activation is usually lower and less coordinated in people with back pain, and the atrophy again. Interestingly as well, is that people who have acute injuries tend to have associated lumbar muscle atrophy as well. So certainly in the multifidus. So people come in with an acute injury. A study was done by Hydes and colleagues, I think. And the people who came in with acute injuries found that they had lumbar muscle wasting as well. And they did another follow-up study as well, and also did some studies looking at people coming out of injury as well, and found that the degree of the improvement in their back pain was actually related to the degree of improvement in their lumbar musculature as well. So the amount it actually hypertrophied and the amount of improvement in atrophy that was seen. So it's interesting that first time, and certainly the impact on whether it becomes chronic or not, is also related to how strong and how well developed the actual lumbar musculature is. I'm kind of aware. What time did we start?
About 42, so you have another 20 minutes.
Okay, I'm going to try and rush through these next kind of bits then and kind of move on to what I'm kind of doing. Okay, so briefly just to touch again on the indigenous populations. Now, I had this kind of idea that, well, if it's a physical characteristic, then it's not necessarily going to be environmental causes or, you know, the whole sort of like westernization, you know, we all work in offices and we all lift heavy things or whatever, that's having an impact on it. So I thought, I'm going to go have a look like Western Price did with indigenous and traditional populations and see what the rates of back pain are in them and see whether, you know, adhering to a traditional paleo, primal lifestyle or whatever you want to call it, actually, you know, reduce the rates of back pain we see. And all the kind of like traditional populations that I could find literature on and research on found that, you know, the rates were just as high and in some cases higher than the back pain we actually get in Western populations. So interestingly, it doesn't really matter whether you kind of adhere to a traditional diet or lifestyle or whatever. There seems to be back pain everywhere we go. Now I put a question mark next to the rural tie just because of the discrepancies in some of the research, but on the whole, it is very, very prevalent regardless of where you go. Now, I've added in a slide here with some of my recent thoughts just to quickly go over. Now, if that's the case, I thought that potentially there must be some sort of evolutionary reasoning for why we've got a high prevalence of back pain. There must be some sort of structural compromise, perhaps, is the word to use, that evolution has had to make, evolution has resulted in, that means that we've potentially got weaker back muscles than we really need. And I've been doing a bit of research into it and writing a few blog posts on it. I'm working on a series at the moment, which will get finished at some point. Just looking at how kind of like the lumbar spine has evolved and how that, and I saw links with my research and how strengthening the lumbar extensor muscles actually links back to this, and how there is an evolutionary basis for weak lumbar extensors. Now, just as a kind of background, Hylobates is a macaque, I believe. Well, it's a type of old world monkey. Basically, old world monkeys are generally anatomically representative of early Miocene apes, sort of before the Paleolithic era, in the early Miocene, when we were arboreal, quadrupedal, four-legged, up in the trees, walking, locomotive creatures. And what we had was, we used to have very long, sort of 6 or 7 lumbar vertebrae. What then happened is we kind of evolved into these short-backed, terrestrial, kind of on the ground and branched, swinging kind of apes. And what subsequently happened was that required a shortening of the lumbar vertebrae, because using what's called brachiation, which is kind of swinging between the trees, requires a stable platform from which to brachiate from. So this is actually an image of a chimpanzee's spine and also his pelvis. And you can see the lumbar spine has shortened dramatically. And what's also happened is the iliac crests have come up, elongated, and they cause like an entrapment of the lumbar spine. So what happens is we've gone from big long spine to really short spine with a lot of passive rigidity and a lot of passive structural integrity there. So what subsequently happens is, over that period of time, we've gone from having a relatively massive and strong erector spinae, which was involved heavily in our locomotion, to having a relatively small one in terms of cross-sectional area. And the cross-sectional area of a muscle has an impact on the actual amount of force it can generate. So smaller muscles generally mean weaker muscles. So that kind of sets an evolutionary basis for why, potentially, a lot of people have got weak back muscles. And this is what I see when I get people in for testing in the lumbar extension machine, which I'll go through in a moment as well. So in that case, what can you do about it? Well, there are 2 different kind of like methods of treatment. There's the passive treatments, which aim at symptom relief. And this is one of the reasons why the costs of treating back pain are so high, is because a lot of treatment options focus on relieving the symptoms, relieving the pain, and never focusing on what the actual underlying causative factor is. So things like bed rest, ibuprofen, painkillers, that sort of thing, massage, they all focus on pain relief and actually removing the perception of pain, removing the experience of pain. So they're great on the short term. You get rid of your pain for a while. But eventually it comes back because they haven't dealt with the cause. They haven't dealt with what's actually the mechanism which is actually stimulating the pain response. The value of these sorts of treatments, and there is some value in them, is in terms of the severity of your pain. If you've got really bad pain and you need to begin an active treatment program, sometimes these sorts of treatments can be very useful in beginning that process if it's hard to overcome the pain and get involved with a program. So in that respect, they shouldn't be immediately dismissed as being completely disuseful. There is a role for them, but it's knowing what role they should play in a treatment program. For years and years and years, doctors would recommend bed rest for back pain, but they're starting to realize now that it doesn't really help. So that's a good move. The next kind of area is active treatment options, which are physical treatment options aimed at trying to address the actual cause of your back pain. And the traditional kind of areas are looking at physiotherapy, so physical manipulation of the joints. And there's a really long history of using manipulation techniques such as McKenzie and stuff, and they've been very useful in research and in clinical practice in reducing pain outcomes and improving functional outcomes, improving the function of the joints that the physiotherapists are manipulating. But one of the problems with it is, and it's unfortunately just a problem with the technique and no fault with the kind of physiotherapists of their own, it's just that the technique relies on a subjective sort of like the clinical wisdom, if you like, of the physiotherapist. So it's very difficult to provide a very sort of like, objective and valid measurement of what the joint's actually doing. So although it can be useful, it's very difficult to then get a sort of like baseline measurement that is accurate and provide a progressive intervention to try and sort of tackle that and then remeasure again and get accurate results and think, I definitely know that that's improved. So one of the things we can do instead is actually apply a progressive sort of like exercise program and not necessarily focus on sort of like physical manipulation, which to an extent involves the combination of a subjective sort of like interpretation and also the kind of wisdom of the actual physiotherapist. Now there are three kind of like areas of exercise that we can look at and which the literature kind of looks at. One of them is kind of general activity, which is basically this idea of get on with it. If you've got back pain, get on with it. Just be active, do what you can. You know, go for a run, go do whatever, take part in a class. And some areas of research have focused on this, and you know they've shown relatively good outcomes in terms of pain response. The problem is it's very difficult to say that they're wholly effective because they don't necessarily use in their methodologies objective measures of function. So it's very difficult to objectively say, you know, functional outcomes have improved, pain may have reduced for whatever reason, maybe because of a kind of just general outcome of the exercise, but it's very difficult to objectively validate that. The second kind of like school of thought in terms of exercise is this whole idea of stability training and motor control training, and it's very big in the kind of like sports performance areas, and it's also very big in rehab areas as well. And there are a number of problems with this approach, I feel. In terms of the actual controlled trials done to look at its effectiveness, again, it does show improvements in outcome measures such as pain and disability and that sort of thing. But the problem is, on a theoretical basis, its underlying premise is very, very flawed, and it seems to be that, in general, it's probably just a generalized exercise effect from doing the activities that are having an impact on it. So, did you just put your hand up, Anthony? No. Oh, seeing things. So, for example, the whole motor control thing, if you guys are familiar with the high-intensity training literature, and certainly Doug McGuff's Body by Science, they discuss in quite detail, you know, the whole fallacy of training a specific skill, you know, doing a plank or bouncing around a Swiss ball or whatever, these specific skills, and question the actual transference of that skill and the actual muscle recruitment patterns that are used during that skill to other activities. So, on that basis, doing these motor control and stability exercises, it's very tenuous to suggest that it's the actual motor control that's being transferred to then reduce pain and injury rates and improve disability. It's probably just a general adaptation in the actual musculature rather than an improvement and a transference of the kind of skills involved. On another level as well, a lot of recent research has focused on new sort of like techniques of measuring range of motion and actual joint motion intersegmentally. So the lumbar spine, like I said earlier, is made up of 5 different vertebrae. And what a lot of research recently has focused on is how those individual vertebrae move and how the muscles around those individual vertebrae control that. So not only does that, you know, full fallacy to the whole motor control theory and a misinterpretation of skill transference, but one of the problems with it is the studies that have looked at people with back pain have suggested that people with chronic lower back pain have a lot of variability in the intersegmental movement of their vertebrae. But the problem is, so does everyone. As soon as you get above the sort of lower vertebrae where the majority of movement actually occurs, it seems to be that the movement is very individual. You could take a population of healthy individuals and find massive variability between individuals. So it makes it quite hard to then say, well, oh, it's definitely that which is causing an impact on you know, their actual function of their lumbar spine, because the majority of movement occurs at the lower levels of the vertebrae, and the majority of that movement is produced by the larger musculature externally, and the kind of passive rigidity is provided by the internal musculature. But again, that motor control theory, it's not necessarily training that particular skills is going to help there. So what we then move on to is this idea of progressive strengthening and in particular high intensity strength training. So without going into detail, because I'm aware of the time, of, you know, high intensity training principles, you know, read Body by Science, read all the literature in the area. In fact, I will quickly mention actually that I'm actually co-authoring a paper with Doug at the moment, so hopefully that will be published at some point and you guys will be able to read that, which would be quite interesting. But anyway, yeah, progressive strengthening. So, resistance exercise, this is going to be. One of the question marks though is, do these exercises train the lumbar extensor musculature? So we've got a deadlift, good morning, Roman chair, we've got a generic, I think that's a Cybex back extension exercise. One of the problems with all these exercises is they involve hip extension as well. So there's movement at the hips as well as movement at the lumbar spine. And when we're looking at any kind of movements, any sort of like gross compound movements, the body always seems to find a way of making things efficient and making things efficient in terms of energy expenditure. So when we're looking at exercises that involve movement around the hips, the larger and stronger muscles of the glutes and hamstrings tend to do the majority of the load bearing. Now, studies have been done to look at activation of the lumbar extensor musculature in these various exercises. In fact, one of the students has just compared stiff leg deadlifts and traditional deadlifts, and the lumbar extensors are definitely active in terms of using electromyography, which measures the electrical activation of the muscles during exercises whilst these exercises are being done. But that doesn't tell us anything other than they're active. That doesn't tell us the extent of their activation, or it can do, but there are various flaws involved with the technique. All it says is they're active. Standing here now, my lumbar extensors are active. That doesn't necessarily mean, though, that they're getting a sufficient stimulus to produce an adaptive response. They need to be loaded sufficiently and fatigued sufficiently to actually produce that adaptive response. So the problem with all of these exercises is they allow hip extension and they allow the glutes and hamstrings to do the majority of the load bearing. Studies looking at comparing traditional back extension machines with what we'll move on to in a sec, which is the lumbar extension machine produced by Med-X. Also, studies looking at comparing the Roman chair exercise to the lumbar extension machine show that as long as hip extension is allowed, isolated lumbar extension strength isn't increased because the lumbar musculature presumably isn't loaded sufficiently and fatigued sufficiently. Also, James Fisher, the guy who's going to be coming in on Sunday as well to do the exercise and nutrition Q&A, has just finished a study he's been doing comparing the stiff leg deadlift with the lumbar extension machine. And interestingly, stiff leg deadlifts don't really improve your lumbar extensor strength. A couple of people improve their lumbar extension strength, but not to a significant degree, and on the whole, most people didn't. So what can we do then? So for you guys, maybe you're not going to all have access to equipment like this. So in those cases, how many of you are from London actually? Okay, quite a lot of you. Okay, you guys will have access to the equipment. Camden, I think it is, there's a facility called Keyser Training. They have a full range of Med-X training equipment, and they have a medical version of the lumbar extension machine here. And I think they have an exercise version as well. The version here is the equipment we've got at the university, which has all the testing facilities on it as well. And the main principle behind it is these restraint systems. So what these restraint systems do is basically lock the pelvis in place by applying force down on the femurs via the thigh restraint, which creates this kind of like fulcrum, this pivot point. The footboard then applies force up the lower legs, which hits the femur restraint, which then converts the force backwards to the femur. So what it does is essentially it holds the pelvis down and back against this pelvic restraint here. And what happens then is no movement forwards and back can actually, and upwards can occur from the pelvis. So any flexion and extension movement that occurs just occurs at the lumbar extensors. So what we can do is we can more effectively load them. Now coming back to the evolutionary perspective, one of the reasons perhaps that we've got stronger glutes and hamstrings is because of the way our gait patterns have evolved. When we kind of like our backs shortened, we went to sort of like this bent hip, bent knee gait, if you think of how like chimpanzees and gorillas move. And that involved a heavy influence, a heavy involvement of the glutes and hamstrings. So potentially there's a pathway there for where the glutes and hamstrings became massively powerful, massively strong. And now we're in this position where we've got an elongated lumbar spine again to allow bipedal movement, two-footed, two-leg walking. And we've got this legacy of big, strong glutes and hamstrings, but weak spine muscles, which creates this just recipe for high levels of or high prevalence of back pain. So what we can do is we can isolate it and effectively test in isolation. Now, testing in isolation is important because any of the previous tests that researchers used looking at extension generally looks at trunk extension. So they've got the participants in a testing machine and not secured the pelvis. So it's very difficult for them to say that we're testing the lower back, because the hips and the hips extension is involved, the glutes and hamstrings are involved. So the actual measurements they take are going to be a combination of all of those factors, and you can't isolate that one factor. But what this machine does is isolates that and allows us to get a very objective and valid picture of lumbar spine function, and we can measure for a full range of motion, and we can produce and look at what their strength curve looks like. In general, people with back pain tend to fall even below the kind of like normal range of strength. When we look at things, we have this kind of like bell curve. In the middle is the average. Some people are really strong, some people are relatively weak, but most people with back pain tend to have really low levels of lumbar extension strength. They tend to fall below the norms, or certainly only just make it up into the bottom range. So, just to finish up then, what am I doing? So let's bring back this diagram that we looked at the start. So what I'm doing is looking at some research using the lumbar extension machine to kind of plug some of the gaps. Now, the lumbar extension machine's rehabilitation and strengthening using high intensity exercise. 5 minutes? Cool, just wrapping up. What this allows us, the majority of research, and there's been a hell of a lot of research looking at it, shows that one, yeah, it improves lumbar extension strength, it improves isolated lumbar spine function. Great, we can objectively measure that. The research shows it, we know that works. 2, it improves pain outcomes. Massive studies have been done using the MedX machine. All of the studies done in people with back pain show improved pain outcomes, along with improved function, improved lumbar extension strength. So as we improve strength and we improve joint function, we've got a nice objective measure there. We find that pain's reduced, and we also find that disability levels measured sort of using more subjective clinical measures are improved as well. So great, we know that it works in terms of improving function and improving pain. And if you guys can get access to the Kaiser facilities, you guys can get access to it as well. And if you've got back pain, you can take part in an intervention to use that to strengthen your muscles. But the thing is, coming back to these kind of like associative factors involved with back pain, my thoughts on these are that potentially these are more symptoms rather than causes. So it would be interesting to see whether or not, if we're addressing the potentially ultimate cause. I use the word ultimate. If any of you are familiar with Jared Diamond's book, Gun, Germs and Steel, he uses this idea of proximal causes and ultimate causes. The ultimate cause being what causes these things, these extra proximal causes, which then have an impact on the latter measures like pain, disability and that sort of thing. And if we consider that potentially weak lumbar extension muscles are what's having an impact and causing these other issues, like limited range of motion, degenerated discs, gait variability, all these other physical symptoms, what we might see is if we address that ultimate cause, we might see an impact on these other proximal causes as well, or these potential symptoms. So what my research is looking at is if we improve lumbar extension strength, we improve pain, reduce pain, improve disability, great. But can we also look at this idea of improving range of motion as well? Now, some of the research looking at it has improved range of motion, but what an interesting thing is most people with back pain have a limited range of motion to begin with. So clinicians employ a limited range of motion intervention. Now, Bill DeSimone talks a lot about limited range of motion exercise, and the theoretical basis of why he suggests avoiding extremes of the range of motion. So for lumbar extension, it's going to be extremes of flexion, extremes of extension, is because in those positions, the muscles aren't necessarily what's being loaded. It may be the passive tissues, the tendons, the ligaments, the bones. They're going to be what's loaded as well. So what we're looking at doing is seeing whether or not we can actually, on the MedX, take the exercise, limit it to a very small range of motion, avoiding those extremes, and see whether or not that still produces full range functional outcomes, and see if that still produces improvements in this associated symptom of limited range of motion. Secondly, we're going to look at gait variability as well. I showed Anthony it when he came up to the lab. We've got what's called a Vicon system, and it's actually a 3D imaging system where, if any of you guys have seen how kind of like Lord of the Rings was put together, when they did Gollum, they stick all these little ping pong balls all over him, and then he does all this stuff, the cameras record it. It's actually the same system pretty much. So what I can do is I can take participants in and I can marker them all up, film them using these 10 3D cameras and then reconstruct that and have an animation and see exactly how their lumbar spine is moving relative to their pelvis whilst they're walking. So I can see how variable it is to begin with, and then look to see what impact strengthening those muscles has on improving the way they walk as well, improving this kind of extra symptom that's associated with lower back pain. And lastly as well, we're going to look at what effect loading has actually on the lumbar, on the discs as well. We know that, you know, progressive high intensity strength training loads the muscles, it improves increases hypertrophy, increases strength. We know that it increases bone mineral density. In fact, you know, studies have looked at what effect the lumbar extension machine has on vertebral bone mineral density, you know, the strength and integrity of the actual vertebrae, and found that it increases bone mineral density as well. One thing that hasn't been looked at, and it's the only structure that in the lower back that you know has an impact on back pain, hasn't looked to see whether it actually has any effect on improving disc health. So most people with back pain do to some extent, especially as you get older, get, you know, disc degeneration, which can turn into herniations and bulging, etc. And some people have got this idea that the more you move, the more it creates variances in pressure across the disc. So as you bend forwards and backwards, the discs basically get squashed and extend at either side. So those kind of extension movements create this suck-squeeze mechanism, is what it's been termed as, to increase hydration to the disc. But what I wanted to kind of look at was, well, maybe that works in terms of physiotherapy, but what about the effect of the actual strength training on it? You know, does load have an effect on it? And it may well do, because the study that looked at bone mineral density found that the changes in bone was mainly found on the soft sort of like bone on the interior, which is very closely associated with the disc health as well. As discs degenerate, that tends to degenerate as well. So there may be a link there that it could potentially have an effect. In addition as well, a recent study that was published, a big study in Germany, found that the heavier the loading of exercise people did, so the people who did weightlifting and that sort of thing, tended to have better disc health than people who did things like long distance running as well. And I kind of alluded in a blog post a while back to the fact that, you know, repetitive sports, you know, marathon running, triathlons and things like that aren't very good for your back health. So there's a potential link there whereby if we ask that question and we employ this intervention, we might be able to see an effect on all these different outcomes and see whether or not, in terms of a holistic approach, this intervention can have an effect on all the kind of aspects of back pain. So that's the whole idea, and hopefully that can kind of like provide some benefit you get for anyone who gets back pain. But for the meantime, you know, the research certainly does suggest that anyone who gets back pain should really be employing this kind of intervention. It's really strongly supported, and it's a far more objective method of treatment than any other kind of sort of currently existing treatment. So to conclude, just a summary of kind of what we've gone through there today. I'm consciously aware of the time. So if there are any questions, I'll wait for. Do you want me to repeat it, or? Yeah?
We can take more too off camera.
Okay. So you mentioned that in some cases the actual area of pain may not necessarily be the area in which a symptom is or the actual problem lies. Has your research come across anything that suggested a correlation between lower back issues and upper back or shoulder pain?
I'll be honest, it's not something that I've specifically focused on. It's like I made a point of at the beginning. It's not. I wouldn't want to kind of like step outside my area of expertise. So it's not something that I'm aware of whether or not there is a correlation. But I've not looked extensively into the research. So that there may be, there may not be. But I'm not entirely sure.
It seems to me like the only way to solve it is to use the medics machine. Is there any other way? Because I don't think most people won't have access to it.
No, you're absolutely right. And as gloomy as it sounds, I think in terms of the way our spine is structured, it is certainly the best way to do it. But it may not necessarily be the only way. The exercises I went through to begin with, they do activate and load the lower back. And in some cases, they'll provide a stimulus for producing adaptation in them. Doug McGuff actually went through a few exercises on a few videos of potential exercises which you could use to load the lower back. The only reluctance I have with exercises like that is, although they activate it, it's very difficult because the research hasn't looked at it to see whether or not they sufficiently load it to produce an adaptation. But like we've seen with other exercises, general activities, this whole motor control, core stability training and that sort of thing, it improves outcome measures such as pain. So it's likely that there is some sort of general adaptation. So although the loading may not be sufficient to produce the degree of results that you see using something as advanced as the Medix machine, it's probably worth doing as long as you can do them appropriately and safely, and following sort of like high intensity principles. Then you'll likely see an effect from them. But if you want best results, it's obviously best to kind of like use the best equipment available. But yeah, if you've not got access to it, and this is one of the reasons why I'm doing the research as well, because just to draw a contrast for you, the Medix website has a facility locator. So anyone who buys Medix equipment tends to load it, register with the website, and anyone can search where a facility is. In the UK, there are 5 facilities. And that's not including our one. So there are 6 facilities in the UK, which I know have a Medix lumbar extension machine, compared to just the Florida area on its own, which has about 57 facilities, I think. So yeah, there are loads. A lot of them are in kind of like physiotherapy clinics and things like that. They're not necessarily always in gym-based facilities, but there's a lot more access available. And so what I'm kind of hoping is certainly in this country, people aren't aware of it. People don't know the options available, although it's very sparse. I think by doing the research, presenting at academic conferences and making physiotherapists and clinicians more aware of it and showing how effective it potentially could be will hopefully make people's eyes open a bit more and go, oh, fuck, we need to get a piece of that equipment. We need to make it more available so that we can, we can get that treatment option going and get sort of, patients to come in and use that. But yeah, I think you can get benefit from other exercises, but obviously it's not going to be as good as using the Medix. Wrap on. Okay, I think that's it, guys. If any of you have got extra questions, just come grab me afterwards. Thanks for your time.